Is your low self-esteem impacting your relationship? Watch today's videos for some tips to move through your self-esteem issues in order to have a really connected relationship. Is Diana Garcia. I'm a licensed therapist in Florida, owner of a private practice called Nurturing Minds Counseling. So my video, Signs of Low Self-Esteem, which you can check out here, really had a lot of comments and a lot of people resonated with it. So I really wanted to give you some tips to move through that self-esteem issue in relationships. When we move on, hit that subscribe button now to make sure that you're staying on top of all the mental health content to improve your mental health, relationships, and things like that. Okay, so I want you to start off by really understanding whatever the signs of low self-esteem that you resonated, or if you haven't watched that video in general, when you think of kind of low self-esteem and how it impacts your relationship, I want you to identify, kind of track it back to then the behaviors, right? So kind of like do your own informal analysis, like follow the breadcrumbs. And what I mean is when you notice, let's say you have this fear of abandonment, right? That's a thought that shows up. So let's say you had a disagreement with your partner and the thought shows up that, man, he or she is going to leave me. I'm going to be alone. So that just means that I need to really try to seek reassurance, and I need to make sure that we figure out the situation and that he tells me that he loves me right away, right? So that all those thoughts and that feeling, that anxiety, that uncertainty, whatever, maybe shame because you feel like you're not good enough, whatever it is, right? Tracking those thoughts, those feelings, and then track it back to then behaviors, right? So then what is actually the behaviors that your partner would see, right? So if I was asking your partner, what would he or she say? Oh man, she or he doesn't give me a break. She stays on top of me. She nags me. She doesn't trust me. She checks up on me consistently, right? So I encourage you to identify those behaviors, right? So things that I could see, because then that's going to be a good sign of what you actually need to change. So again, to wrap up, do your own kind of informal analysis to understand what are the behaviors and how those behaviors are showing up in the relationship. So now you understand the behavior part, and we'll get back to that in a second, but I also want you then to understand how potentially past experiences are influencing your behaviors, right? So when you follow those breadcrumbs, right, that fear of abandonment, right, and when you started to explore that, are there stories or history based on your childhood or past relationships that you're noticing as part of the reason that you have some of these uncomfortable thoughts and feelings show up? So it's helpful to identify those past experiences and then start to work through. And I know that seems very kind of general, but in order to start working through, you have to understand what those parts are, right? So is there a relationship with your mom that you have to really work through? Is there a relationship with someone that abandoned you, or in a past relationship where someone betrayed you and there's something that you have to really work through in that end? And it's also helpful when you're identifying the past to distinguish your past from your present. So when I say that, I mean understanding that happened in other relationships. It's not an indication of this relationship. So sparse out the two. And I'm not saying that you're going to have a clean slate, because we all have stuff from our past that shows up. What I'm saying is that, let's say there's an instance with your current partner and you start to feel like you can't trust them, or they're being shady or whatnot. I don't know. I want you to then really distinguish, not based on what's happened to you before, but I want you to distinguish just the behaviors in this relationship. So judge this individual and this relationship on its own, and don't let your past have such a huge influence. You've identified the behaviors that you really need to change, then I'd encourage you to really understand kind of what are ideal behaviors that you want to embody. And so this might be a little bit of maybe you're not sure because you've never been in a relationship where you didn't exhibit these behaviors, but I'd encourage you kind of to think about feedback that you've gotten from different partners in terms of the behaviors that really kind of make it difficult to be at times in relationship with you. So if you think about what would be those ideal behaviors, So think about, again, back to this example of this fear of abandonment. Is the goal for you to be able to have those thoughts and feelings and then be able to sit with those thoughts and feelings and not kind of reach out or be insistent or whatnot? So I want you to then identify those ideal behaviors, because then those are going to be goals and markers that you're going to start working towards. It's really kind of trying to incorporate some more mindfulness or awareness of when these things are showing up. Because the truth is, you're not going to be able to change behaviors unless you're aware that they're starting to show up. So a lot of times that is kind of getting really clear on are there certain triggers for you that keep showing up, and whenever they show up, that's when you engage in these behaviors that aren't helpful? Or are there certain things that you can point to in yourself that are going to start to be clues like, man, when you start to really have racing thoughts and your heart beats really fast, that's when you start to really struggle with anxiety, and then you're more likely to engage in behaviors towards your partner that aren't helpful. So I would encourage you to pick out like, what are the clues and hints for you, like that you need to really be mindful when you're in the situation, because unless you're mindful, then you can't change the behavior when it's actually happening. Piece is identifying what are going to be the things that you're going to do in those moments, right? So it's not just helpful to identify the behaviors that you're going to do, the ideal behaviors, but really having a plan of action that when certain things show up, like, what are you going to do instead, right? Are you going to reach out to a friend instead? Are you going to journal? Are you going to take a walk? How are you going to take care of yourself in that moment? So when we get stuck in old patterns, we tend to just kind of default. But if you can pause, like I mentioned, that's helpful, but it's helpful to understand what are you going to do instead. And this might be a little bit of trial and error and experimenting, like what are going to be the things that you do in those moments instead of those unhelpful behaviors. So give yourself that space to experiment. And it's really helpful to understand they don't have to be these huge behaviors, tiny micro behaviors. I think there's a misconception that we have to do this like really different, important thing in the moment. And sometimes it's as simple as, hey, I want to go really reach out to my partner and like text and so forth. And so I have to do something really big. No, maybe that just means you put the phone away and you go take a walk or you go take a ride so that you can have your moment of grounding. Maybe you go to the park, maybe you go do a workout. Again, so just thinking about like the tiny micro behaviors that are going to help you get through that moment. Piece in terms of just kind of a general mindset piece to have in mind, it's that you are worthy of being in a loving and healthy relationship. So even if you have low self-esteem and you're working through that, and whether that low self-esteem shows up as like engaging in unhelpful behaviors, I really want you to acknowledge that not only are you worthy, but you don't have to earn your worth, right? So the whole point in changing these behaviors isn't so that you are all of a sudden worthy. It's for you to show up a different way in your relationship that matters to you and its value aligned. But having this mindset that just who you are as a person is enough. That doesn't mean that some of the behaviors don't have to change because those behaviors aren't helpful, but having that real clear mindset. And I know with negative thoughts and self-esteem, your mind's going to constantly tell you that you're not. And I don't even want you to like engage with those thoughts to try to challenge them or so forth. I just want you to have kind of sit in this seat of confidence that if you could start to really lean into you are worthy, you are enough, you don't have to hustle for your worthiness or bargain for it, then maybe that can make some of the changes that you have to do a little bit easier. Okay, so this next tip is all about being able to express your needs and feelings in a relationship. So your low self-esteem might show up as maybe not really talking about your needs or not wanting to rock the boat. So it's helpful to really understand that in a healthy and safe relationship, both partners are allowed to express their needs. So what do you need to do to start to like let your partner know what you need, how you're feeling, and also acknowledging that it's helpful for your partner to know maybe some pertinent history or background as to maybe why certain things show up for you and maybe what you need in those moments. Now, it might not always be the helpful thing to do that when you're in the heat of the moment, especially if you can't express it in a way that your partner can hear it. So really leaning heavily on a gentle startup. So how you express it, watching your tone, using I statements, and you can learn more about that in this book therapy review I did on John Gottman's book. But either way, kind of really taking ownership for how you express the message so that it's most likely that it's going to get received by your partner. One though, it's also important to be able to receive feedback from your partner, right? Without shame or lashing out, because a lot of times if you have low self-esteem, either you completely withdraw and shut down, or maybe you get really big. But part of being in a healthy relationship is that you are open to feedback. So what I'd encourage you to think about is how can you put yourself in a space where you can hear feedback? And maybe sometimes it's just not the right time, and you can share that with your partner, like, hey, I'm so overwhelmed, there's too much going on, like I'm not in a space to hear this, but I want to be. So maybe we can wrap back around in an hour or tomorrow or this weekend or whatnot. But what's really important is that when you're receiving feedback, it's kind of catching and noticing if your mind starts to kind of really internalize that and like criticize yourself, because then that's not helpful, right? If you just start to shame yourself and make yourself feel like crap, and then that keeps you stuck, it's not going to be helpful in terms of like hearing your partner or hearing like what they need from you. course, part of being in a healthy relationship means being able to set boundaries and respect boundaries, right? So it's kind of twofold. This goes back to expressing your needs, but also setting appropriate limits on what you need, what's okay, what's not okay in a relationship. And also same thing from your partner, respecting what they feel is okay and what's not okay. And maybe sometimes there's a clash. So there's either a value difference or something you guys need to work through. It might be a perpetual issue. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that's something that you guys are going to have to learn to talk and work through. Okay, this tip is all about healing kind of any wounds in the relationship. So I talked about before kind of separating when there's been past hurt and separating and giving kind of your current partner the benefit of the doubt. But I also want to acknowledge like maybe there's been wounds in the relationship, especially if it's a longer term relationship. So we talk about like maybe there's something that happened at some point in your relationship, but there was a lot of pain, betrayal, hurt, and you feel like you can't really move through it. You're really stuck. And that's part of the reason that maybe some of this low self-esteem shows up. And so it's helpful to identify and acknowledge, is there one or multiple attachment wounds that have happened in your relationship? If so, how do you need to move through it? Like what's keeping you stuck? Is it that you feel like you guys haven't really talked about it? Or do you feel like your partner really doesn't understand or get it? Do you feel like they're continuing to do these same things? And so maybe they really don't get it. So it's helpful to identify what these attachment wounds are. So that's a place that you need to work on as a couple together. And individually, maybe it's something that you need to acknowledge and understand how this attachment wound keeps showing up. And maybe your partner's completely unaware. Another piece that I think it's really important is to really have other areas outside of your relationship that you're focusing on, including other social relationships. So other friendships, families, work relationships, groups that you're a part of, hobbies. Because a lot of times if we're so exclusively focused on our romantic relationship, it almost means that like there's too much of our time and energy that's dedicated to it. Now, I'm not saying obviously a romantic relationship is important and it should be, and you should be dedicating time and energy. If you're finding that you're not dedicating enough of it, then that's another issue. And it's like, are you doing some avoidance, right? And even avoidance that looks good on the outside, like, oh, you're taking on this great cause to volunteer and help, but really part of you is doing that so you don't have to be at home as much dealing with your partner. So I don't know, but what I am saying, it is helpful, especially if someone that, if you notice you tend to exclusively put too much time and your energy into your relationship, and that at times it feels like it's like the only relationship that you have that's sustaining you, that's not really helpful or sustainable, because one relationship can't really meet all our needs. And so it's really helpful to kind of think about other areas or other relationships in your life that you can really start to foster and grow and spend some of your time and energy on those. Subscribe to my email newsletter to get more videos or tips or content directly into your inbox and make it easier for you. I really share book recommendations, things to improve your mental health, workbooks, and things like that. There might be a workbook related to this video. Comment workbook if you think that'd be really helpful for you. And as always, I encourage you to continue nurturing your mind, body, and soul, whatever that looks like for you. Thanks, guys.